Hello everyone, today we talk about the First Lombard League wars, and so specifically the wars that pitted Frederick I Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor of the Hohenstaufen house, who reigned from 1152 to 1190, and so to revive imperial authority across a fragmented realm, and the communes of northern Italy, originating in irreconcilable visions of authority. This is one of the most important topics in medieval European warfare, and it has not received adequate coverage on Schwerpunkt. Technically, I remember one of my very first videos that came out of the lottery/extraction was exactly the Battle of Legnano 1176, that today we will obviously discuss as the climax of the whole wars between the Lombard League and the Holy Roman Emperor. But at the same time, being a very old video, it's painful to watch. I was actually thinking about remaking another video about the Battle of Legnano. That today obviously would be really something. There is this sort of general realization, and of course we routinely dissect so many different topics on Schwerpunkt as the years go by, as a matter of fact, but a battle analysis like the Battle of Legnano, that otherwise is sort of a fairly simple battle in the core elements, would perhaps at some point occur. There are actually, as we'll see today, other battles. Some are sort of more or less known. Others sometimes like properly fly under the radar in terms of pop culture. I also made videos about the Lombard League at some point, but never in a straightforwardly foundational fashion, right? This was really in the early days of Schwerpunkt, and now that I think about it, I could insert the Lombard League as such, as a properly a polity in the original series, which does make sense, even though it was just an alliance fundamentally. But we should perhaps start doing so, because in the Holy Roman Empire, both south and north of the Alps, there are such leagues that are quite fascinating. There are also other cases here and there in the rest of Europe. Today we talk, however, warfare, right? This is for our campaign series that I decided to specialistically introduce last year. And so we're covering all the most important military histories of especially the medieval millennium. As you know, we have to cover all history for that matter. And so this is an immense topic, one that today will not be able to exhaust. It's probably going to be a long video, but it deserves all the attention it gets, reason for which we'll dissect all of this in many other videos to come. There is also a bigger context to this, like learning of the wars between Frederick I and the Lombard League requires a certain level of sort of political, cultural, even ethnic awareness, because this definitely wasn't a clash between the Germans and the Italians per se, right? There were lots of Italians fighting alongside the emperor. I think you're well acquainted on Schwerpunkt with this kind of sort of imperial Catholic traditional sense of community of belonging. There is something very unique in the Italian communes in the way they are developing, and indeed these two phases. Naturally, we'll make another video about the wars of the Second Lombard League under Frederick's grandson and namesake, right, in the first half of the 13th century. There we actually have something already. Recently I made a video about Frederick II's siege of Rome, and also there are so many important battles and figures, for example King Heinz, that at some point we'll have to cover in the biography series. So we took our time, several years to get here, but I think it's time to finally spread our wings. Regarding the aforementioned context and sort of the general historical awareness and background, you should have to fully understand, of course, some of the more complex issues at hand here. You can, however, check my pretty large playlists about the Holy Roman Empire, the Italian Communes, the House of the Hohenstaufen. There is really a lot in terms also of just ethno-cultural description of German, Italian mentality, especially at war, etc. So today we will have the chance to look at this in one of the most core events, right? And I must say also this, that usually medieval Italian warfare, as Italian warfare in general, does not get much attention, while the wars of the First Lombard League and the struggle with Barbarossa are admittedly well historiographically covered instead, right? So there is actually I worked with scholars that actually studied this, including, I don't know, John Franz wrote an article about the Battle of Carcano, and I publish with him currently. So there is sort of a lot of interesting attention, bibliography, general coverage. I can say maybe in pop culture, an adequate amount of attention to this. I suspect that, as usual, we've seen this also for even bigger battles, especially from a strictly military point of view, like Tagliacozzo, for example, that I'm literally the only person that has covered. Again, this is, together with Markfield and Benevent, truly the largest battle in 13th century Europe, and basically in medieval feudal warfare, right? And literally, you do not have an attention. That speaks volumes about the massive blind spots, if you blind universes, so to say, that have completely rigged any relevant understanding of, in fact, medieval history, European identity, and so on. Nevertheless, this is at least a phase that, if you especially want to search on, I don't know, Academia Edu, JSTOR, etc., like, it's very easy to find a lot of good and complete information on. There may be some kind of lack of systematic approach to these topics. There is probably a deep lack of comparative awareness, as we always point out, like why, for example, were these battles important in the history of the art of war? How do we compare the development, for example, of Italian infantry? That was not the only, nor even the decisive arm, as a matter of fact, to the one of other Europeans, even though it was the best at this point. Well, I don't hear much of this. YouTube is unfortunately just about the 100 Years' War, the 100 Years' War, and the 100 Years' War, just three battles, as if the entire medieval warfare revolved around them, while they weren't, even the most important, or at least the biggest battles that were being fought at the time. I say maybe not the most important, because indeed they were, but not in absolute terms to especially a military degree. Politically, we can discuss, we just done recently with Bouvines. Once again, it is a relatively small battle compared to the rest, especially of later medieval European warfare, but obviously had a massive influence in the politics of the entire continent. Now, it's also difficult, as always, for any military historian to simply start from some point. Fortunately, on Schwerpunkt, we made lots of videos about Italic history from the 9th to the 11th century that chronologically is actually an incredibly important cut for all European history, identity. Some of you came up recently saying, well, that's actually my post-Carolingian, your post-Carolingian playlist is my favorite. I always love watching that. Yes, there is not really a great deal of awareness about that period as well as a whole. That is normally covered by the Viking era, that, as you know, was somehow marginal, let's be honest, compared to most of continental military development. And especially the history of the various emerging feudal monarchies are a bit left alone, let alone the development, the specific development of the Italic kingdom. How and why an ethnic Italic monarchy failed to emerge and or was suppressed by the Germanic emperors, how the Italic knighthood fundamentally succeeded in establishing communal government during especially the consular phase. That was the same one that we're looking during the wars of the First Lombard League in particular. And in fact succeed in defeating the emperor in this incredibly grueling, destructive, it was some of the most intense and probably big at the time wars in medieval Europe, in medieval history, all right? And I will not give you any sort of more context than this in this video, given that it's really too much, right? And that's why you're lucky to have all those other videos. If you want a linear history from literally, I don't know, the later Roman Empire, the Longobards, before the Ostrogoths, of course, but let's say when an Italic kingdom is established under the Longobards, and then the entire Carolingian, Teutonian, Salian phase until the Swabians, well, you have, by this point in Schwerpunkt's history, like a pretty strong amount of all this. Investiture controversy playlist is also incredibly important. I have a lot of thematic videos on the Hohenstaufen in particular, so we're ready, and here we go. One could say that the tensions between the emperor and the communes arose after, in fact, the same investiture controversy. This was the major church-state clash from 1075 to around 1122, so between the Dictatus Pap and the Concordat of Worms, that pitted popes against emperors over the appointment of bishops and abbots, ultimately weakening concentrated imperial control in Italy, as local urban groups asserted greater independence from both ecclesiastical and feudal overlords, while the papacy gained moral and political leverage through reformist movements that challenged simoniacal practices and clerical marriages. To make the long story short, you know what had happened. Essentially, the Pope had backed the communal rise that was happening on its own against feudal authority, essentially, and especially the bishop counts that de facto controlled the cities of the Italian Communes, northern central Italy, and that had been in fact consistently supported by and appointed as such as by the Holy Roman Emperors. The communes are basically born in a very innovative way by as a university, essentially, as a government acting on behalf of the same episcopal prerogatives that were both comital, in particular. That's what the part that interested in the commune, and episcopal. Comital meant that essentially the city district at that point could be ruled by the commune on behalf of the bishop. That at a different point has also different relevance in the cities. The investiture controversy engulfs Germany in a terrible strain of wars that deeply undermine the national, feudal, monarchic development of the country. Up to that point, yes, had actually been lagging behind compared, say, I don't know, to France or to England, but did have some potential to actually stabilize at some point in history. And the Hohenstaufen will definitely try hard, especially fighting over Italy determined that, right? Then that's why it happened exactly through this wars of Frederick Barbarossa to maintain this power concentration, but the effort failed. And it's not like even the emperors were wrong in wanting to subjugate Italy. Naturally, it was a titanic enterprise. Not even such a great and energetic knightly leader like Barbarossa did. It was really one of the greatest commanders of his era. And that means a lot. There was a specifically brutal mentality, like north of the Alps, that in part was seeking revenge for the in fact, for the detriment that had of the German monarchy that had followed to the investiture controversy. So there were some ethnoanthropological stereotypes involved, right? If anything, most of the times these groups did not quite understand each other. They spoke in German, in Italian. There were some witnesses that had to write this down for formal acts, because these were all public audiences, and eventually there had to be some act of this and written down in Latin. And so you can imagine all the linguistic nuance of these statements and sort of reciprocal understanding were not particularly served. The Germans definitely see the communes as an aberration, but also as something fantastic, right? The imperial chancellors that visit Italy say to the emperor, look, these guys they have literate peasants. Naturally, not the majority of them, but I mean, things that were inconceivable. The idea of these cities dictating rule over imperial vassals in the peninsula, the wealth in and of itself, like Italy being politically fragmented and particularly rich, to say the least, was obviously the best target of the Germans. But the notion, in this sense, that it would be merely a struggle, in fact, between two peoples, or that eventually would take at least the political and strategic scale of, by some degree, in particular the sort of the acolytes of the Swabian Franconian region, and their, especially their episcopal ministeriales, and the Lombard cities of northern Italy is a thing. However, it should also be pointed out that not just in traditional terms, the communes were absolutely not fighting against the imperial institution per se, right? Nor the Pope was actually doing that. And so this is a deep misconception that unfortunately filtered through the interpretation of the mystical fascists of the 20th century that saw in the church this sort of irremediably compromised symbol of some sort of great mother was opposing like a virile, heroic rule. This is not how the system worked. It was actually mutually interdependent, and papacy and empire worked pretty darn well as the papacy with other monarchies to jointly put down, heretic movements to, in fact, favor and foster like a sense of European wellness, coordination, sort of juridical clarity, and much through the same struggle, right? The investiture controversy really confers Europe like an incredible advantage in terms of civilizational development, like a massive extra gear. If you look at the Constitutio Habita of Barbarossa, you have there like the green light to the full recovery of Roman law in the Bolognese Studium. If you look at the Decretum Gratiani, its influence and its foundation, say, reorganization of and formalization of canon law, and all its influence also from a spiritual point of view on the Crusades, it's immense, right? And that's why we can't digress in this. But speaking of the contendants in particular, there is a history not just of Italic loyalty and fidelity to the Holy Roman Emperors, but also one of direct participation to German affairs. Like there was at some point in Frederick Barbarossa's early reign, and we talk about this in one of the videos about him, including the ones about Swabia in particular, that listed all the cities that the emperor was sort of more directly extract sort of contributions from and rely on during expeditions. Essentially, in this mental map, you have an over-reliance of the Hohenstaufen on Swabia and Lombardy. Like the various cities of the empire stretch here. There are others all scattered across the Kingdom of Germany and Italy in particular. As you know, there is a reactivation part of a control in Burgundy, etc. But fundamentally, the core lands of Hohenstaufen power were indeed southwestern Germany and northwestern Italy, practically. Lombardy and Swabia bordering, by the way. Today there is Switzerland and Austria in between, but that's in part exactly the same country from medieval times. Besides, in fact, there were Italic vassals that did participate to German diets. Right, this is especially in the heart of the High Middle Ages, where there was also still this sense that there had been a broader Carolingian Empire, so that even what we understand today more conventionally as just like the kind of German-Italian axis, paradoxically, as a World War II eco. These were naturally northern dynasties that had come to Italy by the time of the Franks, etc. But the idea that there was this sort of power straddling the Alps, and this is something that continued also in other times in parts of Italian history and locations. Think about the Neapolitan kingdom. Just recently we were talking about the Dampierre, the Counts of Flanders having possessions as vassals in southern Italy, all these kind of things, right? So this was probably a universal dimension that bridged all these lines. Just yesterday we were talking about how Knut, the great king of Denmark, of England, of Norway, went over to Rome as a usual pilgrimage, and sort of helped at that point, like compacting Northern Europe under a more direct ecclesiastical administration, etc. So reasoning, as unfortunately many people do when they sort of search on YouTube for topics of this kind in terms of national counterposition, is not quite correct, right? And even more in particular, and we made videos about this because we are on Schwerpunkt, there had been actually pretty successful, effective, and efficient Italic reigns of Germanic emperors. I made some videos about Conrad III, about Lothar III as well. And so we're talking even about the Hohenstaufen. As you know, Conrad was the same uncle of Frederick Barbarossa that had actually descended to Italy and done well, like not for warfare, at least in the Italic kingdom. And that, was something necessary for local government administration, with the communes cooperating with the emperor. So there is actually a happy history, so to say, regardless of the clashes that had already emerged, as we've seen in the videos about the Battle of the Bataria. Milan in particular, Lombardy in particular, had this sense that we explained well, especially in that video about medieval Cremona, that Italic knighthood was actually the Roman Empire, that the actual imperium, the actual golden globe, belonged to the Lombards. And they were kind of right, because without the Iron Crown of Pavia, you could not become Holy Roman Emperor, right? You could come from any other kingdom in Christendom, not even just the Eastern Frankish one, but if you didn't get the Italic crown, you could not become Holy Roman Emperor in Rome. And this is obvious also considering the reality that in order to descend to Rome, you must have secure rare lines. You must have consolidated power in Italy, and only at that point you will be crowned literally as Holy Roman Emperor for being able to control the orbs, right? So there is actually a lot at stake, as you understand. If you look at this in perspective, also if you study what was happening in Europe and in the Mediterranean during the clashes between Frederick Barbarossa and the Lombard League, you realize that practically this thing dictated the policy of all of this system. Meaning, what happened after Legnano regarding, the Holy Land alliances, the same Italic ones, what happened, with the Slavs or with the Kingdom of France, everything changed on the basis on a single battle that was fought, and as others before that had been fought in northern Italy. So it's really a huge thing that in some ways it's sort of regionalized or provincialized in some narratives, especially pop cultural one, in that instead witnessed literally the highest authority, the emperor, fighting against actually also the other universal authority, the papacy, as much as, of course, the Lombard League was backed and subsidized by the Pope as well. This had been going on, again, as we've seen from the Bataria movement as well. And this obviously was a great help, but there is also something deeper about the Lombard civilization, what these Italian communes were really succeeding in doing, that in and of itself is just another huge chapter, and that should be carefully considered also as far as different parts of the peninsula acquired different strategic relevance depending on the situation. I made really lots of videos about the Italian communes, even individually taken, from northern Italy, central Italy, at this point Tuscany, for example, that would later become properly the cradle of Guelphism, and that will become so important strategically in the 13th century. I also made a video about the times and meaning of the Battle of Montaperti, as a matter of fact, is not so directly involved, right? And so one should explain why northern Italy was more prominent, etc. Today, again, I can't do it. This was the minimal introduction that I had to make in order to properly get to the bloody affairs, right? Now, the prolonged dispute of the little bit of context, because I always say that, but I end up not digressing, but this is really necessary. The investiture controversy had seen dramatic events, like also the Emperor Henry IV of the Salian House famously making penitence to Canossa in 1077 to seek absolution from Pope Gregory VII. I made a video about the violent turning point, probably of the investiture controversy at this point, eroding what were the historical bonds of loyalty, in empowering the Italian cities to form sworn associations known as communes, fostering self-governance through elected consuls, and at this point we're talking probably knightly class. Then later in the 13th century we have this merchant-led councils as well that prioritize a different local interest. Like this is often described as some kind of economic interest, but I mean, which power was not taking care of its economic interest? The cities were pretty rich, but the myth they were simply sort of mercantile led is deeply misleading, and especially this is the case in Lombardy, where the so-called people never actually ruled, and in any case, also in those popular communes that developed, especially in Tuscany, etc. It's not like the knights weren't there and weren't part of the magnate estate that, in fact, at some point did retake over. So you want to appreciate that the reason why the communes developed, in part at least, is exactly the fact that for a while emperors intermittently descend in the peninsula, or at least if they are emperors, they do once, but they do not necessarily stay that much. And so self-government for such thriving centers of sort of radical Roman legacy, traumatic urbanization, like unspeakable wealth, to say the least, was kind of obvious, right? And as we'll see now, what the war was technically fought on were those public rights that historically had, in fact, fell in the hands of kings, of emperors, and that had been fundamentally usurped, Barbarossa would say, but de facto taken over in any case in a functional way, and even improved through the local resources in the hands of the same communes. So the communes were not saying the emperor does not have these rights, right? But the way we administer these rights in his absence should be considered as a fruit of our labor, and therefore not simply confiscated, as at some point, like Barbarossa goes full, World War III on this. Like there is this very Barbarossa was a fiery character. Like he was at some point incredibly energetic, prone to ire. He, as we'll see now, actually will inflict the Lombards some unspeakable pain and bloodshed. However, this is what fundamentally made resistance more rigid, right? Certain cities that had called the same emperor to protect them from the expansion, especially of Milan, that was the largest city in the West at this point, together with Paris, will actually end up signing with, in fact, the Lombard League to join it, because it had become clear by that point that the Germans were essentially not seeking any kind of compromise. It was something deeper, and that we should understand actually from, again, exactly the standpoint of Majestas and all what we have seen, also in ideological terms of what was tied with imperial prerogative, etc. So in many ways, this ended up as a wall against wall, and there was no other settlement but warfare. The emperor sought to reassert comprehensive imperial rights, therefore, over regalia, justice, and administration that were literally the entirety of the sources of income of the same communes, as well as any other ruler. So this took on the, as we were explaining before, so the more practical character of literally like these communes, can they live on? Right, as a civilizational experiment, are they able to? And this will be settled on the battlefield, really. And the answer was, in that sense, quite unequivocal. But it took really decades of some of the most brutal warfare in medieval history to be settled, for telling you how many resources were spent in this, and how much, however, how much advancement, how much civilizational development actually stemmed from this, which is one of the key sort of dynamics of the West. The system does not exhaust itself. On the contrary, it starts ramping up, and that's why also this warfare was so escalatory. Barbarossa made his intentions clear in the Diets of Roncaglia, held in 1158 and 1159. These assemblies convened on the plain near Piacenza in the Po Valley. It is, as you know, the most fertile agricultural heartland, crisscrossed by rivers like the Adda and Ticino that supported thriving trade and city economies, drew on Roman legal traditions revived through jurists from the University of Bologna, as we were saying before, where the 4 doctors of law, including at this point, this very generation, Bulgarus, Martinus, Jacobus, and Rogerius, played pivotal roles in interpreting Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis to catalog imperial prerogatives systematically, right? And these diets, again, were the normal diets that emperors or even just kings of Italy held, right, as placita and legislating for the government of the country. Again, in the previous generations had happened smoothly, right? There was always something, of course, violent to deal with, but not in the sense that had been a full in war like the one that will break out now. So it's a very distinct phase, right, also in the local warfare and political history. And also as far as the German-Italian relations in the Holy Roman Empire are concerned. Now, the aforementioned cataloging aimed to reclaim rights that cities had assumed during the power vacuum after the investiture era, producing the Constitutio de Regalibus that enumerated sources of revenue such as minting, tolls on roads and rivers, market dues, and judicial fines. The diets also addressed broader feudal obligations, including the fodrum, supply tax, for imperial armies. This was most important, like the war horses fodder. So again, in the age of feudal warfare, this was as vital as it gets. And the Italians had historically provided this during the imperial expeditions. Again, this is not the point. Like, it's not like Italians did not identify as imperial subjects, right? They will continue doing that, also because it's always the same old story. The emperor, once beaten, is also still the legitimate authority that can sanction those rights and of autonomy, right? This is not independence, this is not secessionism, this is not abolitionism of the empire, whatever. This is straightforward autonomy, liberty, all right? And in fact, these diets had disciplined the same appointment, for example, of the podestas, imperial representatives to oversee local administration. There were always imperial officials that supervised what was happening in the communes. Historically, this will remain. We just said there were feudal entities in Italy that were still ruled by literally some German vassals. We've seen it in the video about the Duchy of Spoleto, for example. So again, the Italic kingdom, and here I presume you know what we're talking about, also in a general institutional sense within the empire, etc., was historically presenting. Also, if you look at the ruling dynasties of the feudal houses, so they were historically habituated to have Germanic interference, ancestry in the nobility. In many ways, of course, this was an Italic kingdom. The same nobility was part, in this sense, of a broader system that had mostly urbanized, had decided probably to, especially from the lower ranks of the vassals, to create the commune, to to increase the autonomy of the cities that were the actual cornerstone, differently from north of the Alps, of local government, exactly to check the pressure of the larger vassals of the emperor that instead were trying to get, like actually in all other lands of Europe, right? Italy just happened to have the more developed cities that were more difficult to control. And that was the point also in which you can argue from different perspectives the war was fought, to in fact be co-opted by the emperor further and to therefore rule on the previous feudal districts that contained the cities, right? And so the political geography may be a little confusing, but once you actually get the institutional process, you don't even have to reason merely in, fragmented polities with all different colors. You understand the mass. This was actually, as the very Lombard League proved, because of its alliance and connection between all these cities, actually a pretty unitary, national, regional force, right? You can't see it, again, all these terms are approximated, but there is no doubt that what you see during the wars here is the commitment of one of the most advanced, actually together with northern France, the single most advanced part of the world at this point. And so you have to consider, even from a German perspective, like how truly different and what kind of new attitude was required in order to be able even to curb these places that were, again, extraordinarily rich, incredibly densely populated, thickly urbanized, fortified. The Po Valley, as we said before, was yet to be fully cleared and sort of reclaimed and so on, but it was heavily canalized already. So even conventional cavalry was not even in the flatlands so effective, and that's why also infantry is so important here, even though, as we will see now, it's also due to the aforementioned social development of various peditus estates. I made a video about the buildup of the Milanese army in the previous generations during the 11th century that gives you an idea how by the second half of the 11th century this was already a might to be reckoned, but always within a broader picture of sort of local issues. Like what makes the Wars of the Lombard League so interesting is that they're actually one of the very few cases in which the Italic kingdom as such went at war with another nation. If you look at medieval history there, the Italians were obviously dominating at this point the Mediterranean. They infiltrated pretty much everywhere. They logistically and strategically sustained the crusading effort, etc. But they're in many ways so content of their wealth that what they do is that they don't have to move that much as a conquering force to enjoy that wealth itself, right? And nor other countries can objectively compete with all that power in and of itself. So when you look at part of the reason why, as I was saying before, this topic is so well historiographically covered is that there is properly an attempt at national subjugation, right? There hardly is in other times in history as well. Like there were naturally episodes like, I don't know, the Carolingian conquest of Italy, the Renovatio Imperii of the Ottonians, but obviously lording over Italy as well, first of all, required local support, cooptation, etc. And at large, in fact, these relations there had been lots of wars, but as a whole, like there had never been like a regional cohesion against a foreign force per se, right? Here and there, provincially, we've seen it in the video about Arduin of Ivrea. There were sort of some frontier areas that were more rebellious, etc. But none of this had ever taken the character of they're actually conquering us as a people to properly impose their rule from another country, right? The Saint Carolingians came to rule in Italy. Right, the Carolingian emperor, they were in Pavia. They did the same identical thing that the Longobards did. So they simply substituted themselves at the top of this enormous country and system, together, especially with its incredibly advanced administrative civil development, that in fact was, let's be honest here, really necessary for the Holy Roman Emperor to do what was essentially to rule over Italy, yes, but in this sense, from there, simply rule the entirety of Europe and the Mediterranean. I mean, the entire purpose of the Hohenstaufen was obviously enough to rule the empire from Rome. Later, Frederick II could do it, say, from Palermo, but where essentially at the center of the system, reactivating the same Roman Empire, reuniting East and West, and actually also treating Germany as some sort of peripheral province overall. It may sound strange because eventually it did not happen, but truly, like had this succeeded, which it didn't, because again, the Italians fought back successfully, the matter took on a completely different character. You really have to wait for the Italian wars to have foreign powers managing essentially to occupy some areas, but essentially parceling out the rest of Italy as some de facto autonomous world, and that was mostly controlled through spheres of influence, because major powers like, I don't know, Venice, Tuscany, the Papal States were independent states, right? So this is a huge, if you understand how important this is, again, it's important to picture this in a universal direction in particular. All of this, in this sense, reflecting Barbarossa's vision of restoring the empire's glory modeled on ancient Roman precedents as well. These are Roman emperors, 100%. Whoever tells you the opposite is lying to you in any meaningful historical way. Like whoever points out that the Voltaire ditto and the entire, like, no, this was actually not a Roman, just know that if you are at that level, it means you are completely unaware of any actual quote-unquote mainstream conventional historiography on the subject. This was fully a Roman Empire, and that was the only way this was actually seen. And any other juridical, metaphysical, political foundation was recognized exclusively as such, right? So the major iceberg in here is the literal civilizational boom of 12th century Italy, and especially with its urban center, together with the wall. Because other thing that, for example, speaking of ethno-cultural differences, in Germany, the city was not the center of the world. All right, it was obviously very important, especially post-Roman Germany had very important cities. Cologne was one of the largest in Europe. But overall, right, communes do not have much of autonomy, just like, people in general don't have much of autonomy, right? The bishop and the count rule. There are the princes of the empire, and then the emperor that sort of tours this kingdom, as you know, also through the succession of its dynasties, does not even technically have a center. This is also for Italy as well, right? But the Italic pattern is completely different because every single part of the kingdom depends on the city, right? North of the Alps in France and Germany, you had vast areas that were ruled by local vassals from their castles, etc. There were some forest areas where some forest communities literally lived more or less separated from the rest of the world. None of this actually occurs in Italy. Everything is thickly entwined, so you cannot basically simply even nest somewhere, right? Of all the sort of dominations that Italy had at this point, you do not see a ethnicization. I mean, a part of the country that becomes like part of another people or another group. This place was just to float on if you were successful, recognized as a leader, but by no means directly controlled, at least in the way that Barbarossa admittedly tried, with an unspeakably large amount of energy, right, of men and resources. So the aforementioned diets explicitly annulled recent territorial expansions by Milan, interestingly enough, such as its earlier conquests of Lodi in 1111 and Como in 1127. This, as you understand, are pretty also earlier events compared to Barbarossa's descent, as we'll see now. This is also very interesting because the commune and the city are two different things. The commune is probably a polity that rules over the city, the district, and so they can also move and conquer other cities and districts, which by feudal districtuation, from an imperial perspective, it cannot be done. Right? Because nobody has ever done this. The Italian cities are the only ones that literally, in Europe, conquer other cities, right? That normally do not have the resources, even just to besiege one another. Admittedly, at this point, also in northern Italy, this doesn't seem to happen by, besieging an entire city. It's mostly like soft, but also hard power at some point, controlling, manipulating, abusing, subjugating another city, right? And Lodi is exactly the matter there, right? They called Barbarossa, and they realized that the situation would have been spiraling out of control. So they side with Milan, the old enemies. Besides Milan was, again, really powerful. It had reduced neighboring cities, including Pavia. And so the traditional crowning place of the Italic kings, and therefore also the kings of the Romans from Germany and the would-be Holy Roman emperors, a city that was for this reason also a traditional imperial ally of the empire, with strong Ghibelline leanings, to say the least. Cremona, known for its engineering expertise and rivalry with Milan in particular, and Bergamo, that is sort of relatively smaller center. At this point, there are actually big differences between the cities, but not as pronounced as they will occur in the later Middle Ages. Well, all these fierce, proud communes had actually subjected him to relative passivity at the rise of Milanese power. It was really concerning, from especially like the perspective of honor and duty of a Holy Roman Emperor that has to be recognized on the basis in which he is able to safeguard the rights of his subjects, that in this case had been broken, had been infringed upon by the Milanese. Revenues and prerogatives previously exercised locally were now to flow, according to the emperor, to imperial fisc, while podesta appointed by the emperor replaced or supervised communal consuls. So these were absolutely, this is like a joke in the sense this meant war, all right? There was no way these cities would give up these prerogatives, because you give up. One thing is, okay, appointing a figure that can have more or less power as a decentralized official, etc. But the consuls are the commune itself, right? We know that commune exists when we know by document that the consuls were elected. These were knights. They literally led like the communal army. They had themselves quite knightly, in the sense, parallel mentality with the entire imperial ideal. They weren't the opponents of the empire. They thought, as we said, that they were the empire. So that if you get that specific mechanism, you immediately realize what was happening here and why this wars broke out. There are estimates suggesting potential annual yields in the tens of thousands of pounds of silver from controlled infrastructure like bridges, mills, and fisheries across the economically vibrant Lombard plain. Again, together, this with northern France is the most disproportionately advanced region in Europe. And Barbarossa was simply saying, now, from a day to another, literally, all this income goes into our hands. This approach intersected with long-standing communal development rooted, as we said before, in 11th century proceedings, where cities had gained an enormous self-confidence and self-awareness. This is crucial also, as we'll see now, from a military point of view. The dynamism of expanding trade networks along alpine passes to the Mediterranean, combined with advancements in manufacturing such as textile production and metal working, plus intensive agriculture in the contado, that is the comitado, the city district, eroded rigid feudal hierarchies in favor of collegial urban governance by these military classes. Below them, the merchant guilds, and so also all these elected bodies that emphasize collective oaths and consular accountability. The consular clans were led by these leaders that were pretty large. There were hundreds of men that also were not just knights. There were notaries, there were merchants, etc. And they were themselves a hierarchy within it. And imagine this, it's as if, all the vassals of a specific region had basically confederated into a city and began to rule it. This is exactly what had happened, all right? Besides other little factors we said before, from Swabia to Lombardy, you just have to cross the Alps. So also the strategy, the logistics of this, obviously it's politics that decides everything. The effort required the commitment of the whole of Germany, and as you know, Henry the Lion there had an important role in even sort of withholding part of his Saxon help to his cousin during some of the most critical moments. It's said that if the Saxons had joined the expedition that eventually led to Legnano, like things would have gone in sort of very different ways. The legacy of Lombard assemblies are also important, like the gyrothings. And so this was the thing of the spears, right? This was an ancient Germanic tradition that was also Roman, if you think about it properly in archaic times, of collective decision-making among free warriors that persisted in modified forms, further predisposed citizens to collective decision-making, rendering them increasingly intolerant of external imposition. And perhaps the single most important thing to understand of the Lombards is that these citizens, naturally you have to imagine the citizen is not merely everybody who lives in the city. Right? The citizen is an elected class with voting rights that participates to the army and to the assemblies. Hence, also the consular magistracy is not random. Right? There is a deep Roman and Germanic legacy in this that makes these citizens truly traditionally and metaphysically convinced that they are, as freemen in arms, noblemen. Sacred, who bore the cingulum militaris. Naturally, there was a difference between, say, the baronially minded communal knight with a massive warrior ethos that had nothing to envy to the feudal counterparts of Transalpine Europe, and the infantry citizen, right, who was maybe, I don't know, a Smith or something, but that still participated, was also crucial for reasons of, as you know, technicalities of say, procuring arms, etc. But this is actually a point that gets always, in my opinion, eschewed or at least properly ignored in the history of medieval Europe. The freest people in the world, not just in Europe, were at this point the Lombards. The entire mythology that, I don't know, the Germanic world was freer, more in contact with this, loser. No, like in the world that had allegedly to be the heir of tribes, etc., people were somebody else's people, right? This is true in a unmistakably promiscuous way in all possible oligarchic and privatistic direction. Germany was not a country freeman, right, as a whole. Like, it was something much more eroded. Already since the mid-6th century, the entire Central, Northern, Eastern Europe was something, aside from the conditions in which they had lived before, where there had always been an aristocracy in charge. Mankind in general is exhausted, right? There is not such a thing like greater freedom increasing in those places. It all goes down in an incredibly and rigidly stratified world. And this continues over and over. I mean, Germany basically exits feudalism in the 19th century as a whole. And these things do matter, because the worldview, the mentality, the spirit, the morality, the same military before is radically different, right? In this sense, the North relies much more on a hierarchical elite concept where all the rest is subjected to it to work for it. Italy, in this sense, is actually of the same mold, because there isn't an inversion of this at all, right? It works exactly in the same way. Like, the consular class, the knights at the top, actually get the rest of the citizens actually to pay extra taxes for fixing their horses if they got crippled in battle. It was having just like a private jet, right, or yacht in comparison. This is not very different from how the Roman equites worked. Literally, there was this idea of a horse that had to be given by the state properly to the valiant knight, because the Romans themselves treasured the idea that the knight was the hero of the situation. And so the idea that you had to simply contribute with your own means, no, you owed something to these higher people, right? So this is the case in Italy as well. But in Italy, this wealth and this power is much more evenly spread, and these communities, in this sense, are much more cohesively participating and identifying with the system that is rendering them ever freer and more powerful, right? And so they were not to give up this for anything in the world. In fact, they consistently show that prefer to die and see their cities destroyed as the extreme ratio, even to keep fighting. If there was hell life after that, as it literally happened with Milan, razed to the ground, rebuilt in a matter of years, right, during these wars. That's the kind of power that these people expressed. Milan's economic and military predominance, built on control of key trade routes connecting the Alps to the Mediterranean and rich agricultural hinterlands in the Contadus, had long provoked rival cities, some of which invited imperial arbitration, as we were saying, precisely to counter Ambrosian hegemony. When we say Ambrosian, we obviously mean Milanese, but after Milan's patron Saint Ambrose, while the emperor's German entourage viewed Italian social and political systems marked by this sort of greater expansion of the Third Estate, the consular elections at the top, and fortified urban militias trained in combined arms tactics, including crossbowmen and disciplined spearmen, as markedly alien from those north of the Alps. Again, this was something that shocked them. Like, there are actual references and descriptions from the followers of Barbarossa. They literally say these guys are light years ahead in terms of civil development, and this is completely unique. We've never seen anything like this. In Germany, again, feudal vassalage and knightly service dominated, where all the system was basically bent to that. Barbarossa's first descent in 1154-1155, undertaken with approximately 1,800 men, drawn mainly from Swabian and other German contingents, including loyal princes, subdued Asti, Chieri, and Tortona. This is in Piedmont fundamentally, and struck at Milanese contado strongholds without directly assaulting the metropolis itself due to insufficient strength. When we say 1,800 men, we're obviously talking 1,800 knights specifically. Then, of course, they had their own infantry as well. So when you look at their armies, they're also very similar, right? There is a different ethos. This is the age of... We should actually spend some positive mentions for German power at this point, because not just in this sense, the German crown is the greatest power in the West. This is also what should be stressed, that nominally, the biggest conglomeration of force here, there are the Byzantines, the French, the English, etc. Germany is the top here, right? Just like after Bouvines, fundamentally, France becomes more important than Germany. At this point, Germany is leading, right? It's truly the favorite power in line with its Holy Roman Imperial mandate to hegemonically take over Europe and the Mediterranean, right? They are the great favorites. And the Germans are also a fresh race. They are, as we're saying here, more primitive, less developed, but they have, in this sense, also due to the fact that they don't really have a frontier, especially in the east, right? So they continuously struggle, expand. They don't have massive surpluses, especially in some parts of the country. So there's this constant, think about the Ostsiedlung. And so this constant expansion, this hard work, this also history of mercenarism, telling the truth. German knights and also other troops had been notoriously employed by the Italians at different times in their history. Think about the Battle of Civitate with the Pope, with the Lombards, the Swabian swordsmen against the Normans. And the Normans obviously crashed them all. We'll talk about all of this. So remember, there is a history of Italo-German sort of cooperation, cultural blend, ethnic mix as well. And so there is something in common in particular with these higher spheres of imperial control, after all. The Germans are tough. Like I made a video about the ideology of the Holy Roman Empire, and other peoples at some points, also sometimes also for rhetorical purpose, experience. This is the age of crusades, so Europeans are starting to get to know each other a bit better in these expeditions. The Germans are tributed that concept that somehow is still stereotypically about them. This idea of rough, cold, brutal. If you look at, obviously World War II memories, like aggressive, also vicious, probably warlike, like military minded, this expansive sort of idea of a freedom that at least manifests, if not as we've seen in the social order, at least in these great knights that are actually at this point not as advanced as the French ones, but they're rapidly sort of gapping the distance. Remember, Germany is still up to exactly the time of Barbarossa that does really a lot in terms of importing Western Frankish feudalism in Germany. Still largely covered in forests, in swamps. It had been, of course, colonized by the Franks, in part by the Romans for quite a long time. So there were areas that were rich, developed, even urbanized. But overall, again, there's this sense of boom that happens exactly at this point. And so that's why this clash is even more interesting, because it really pits literally the single most rapidly rising peoples in Europe. You can make maybe an exception for the French, the English that are also doing great, the Spanish, everybody telling the truth is growing. We look at the West, this is really insane. It's really a tough race, right? And so that's why this clash is so fascinating. Right, we'll make more military historical videos about this. There's this Nordic stereotype already at the time that stems from classical sources as well, that the North generates these tougher men that are more robust, that are better for war, etc. This German youth that leaves for crusade, that is sort of as impetuous as, in fact, unrestrainable. This is the idea of the Teutonic ethos, right? So it's incredibly important to be measured in Italian warfare here. So before we've seen a bit the broader context. So we talk about Roncaglia. Here we're following the chronology. Roncaglia was this diet imposing imperial oversight. It happens during the first expedition. So to settle matters sort of clearly out for everybody to see. And the journey of the Germans continued to Pavia for coronation as king of Italy for Barbarossa in a ceremony affirming traditional rights. We are essentially along the so-called French road, right? So the ancient pilgrim route from Northern Europe through the Alps to Rome for imperial coronation that was here performed by Adrian IV in St. Peter in June 1155. Right, popular unrest in Rome, fueled by local factions and resentment over imperial presence. Rome was, incredibly turbulent to say the least. It does actually have, I just recently made a video about how Rome was administered in this sense. At this point, they had expelled the Pope, by the way. And so it's actually Barbarossa that brings him back. And because Rome had actually a communal autonomy as well, at this point had managed to affirm itself even over the papal signory for a while. And the emperor at this point needs to be crowned, so he actually supports the Pope to get his title and trying to subdue the Romans for what he was necessary. But this is also a shock for Barbarossa because this first expedition was notoriously brutal. Like the first impression from the Italians must have been terrible, right? And a mounting sense of revenge and hatred must have mounted in him that was unleashed later. This situation prompts harsh suppression that also strained relations with the same papacy after all, amid also the ongoing schisms. Very complicated picture here. I'm trying to make a military history, but there would be so much to say. While the return march included the destruction of Spoleto, not just simple destruction of a city. Naturally, Spoleto was not immense, but I mean, it was historically, again, a cornerstone of imperial authority now was being gradually absorbed by the papacy. And the reason why this destruction was carried out was the false payment of the fodrum, the aforementioned fodder, for the same expedition. Customary feudal hospitality tax that burdened locals and highlighted logistical strains of long campaigns reliant on local foraging and allied supplies. This was incredibly relevant because, of course, like these local communities used their fodder for their own expeditions, etc. But it cost really a lot for simply a foreigner that arrived out of the blue, and yes, with a past of sort of institutional tradition, etc., but that in the moment obviously was disturbing where I was living there. And remember that the forage for horses here is a necessity. It's not just a whim. Also from the German side, it's not much that the emperor needs this from a public standpoint of, in fact, his royal rights, but he literally needs this for the expedition because war horses consume an astronomical amount of fodder, not only, by the way. And so this is a huge deal. Again, 1,800 knights already is cavalry in general is a pretty consistent expedition. And consider that this expedition was meant here to be fairly friendly. It was just like the Roman expedition to get crowned and settle matters here and there. And it escalates into this brutality. Also with the Romans rioting and everything. These actions, however, also from Barbarossa's side, signaled a departure from predecessors' relative indifference towards northern Italian affairs, favoring active restoration of effective sovereignty instead. Right? Barbarossa had very clear ideas in mind, and he would pour all the energy necessary in order to reach his goals. The campaign highlighted logistical challenges of operating far from German bases, relying on local allies for supplies while enforcing demands that clashed with emerging urban self-rule traditions that had grown, particularly in the previous generations, through these sworn associations and defensive leagues. Here we are also skipping like different other aspects. There are the Veronese that create issues. again, we don't have all the time in the world, but coming back to Germany, right? It's a bit of a problem if the Etsch/Adige Valley is blockaded by the Veronese, right? If you're interested in this, please watch my videos on medieval Verona that tell you all the story of this. It's incredibly fascinating. The Germans had to take a completely different route to come back home. We're talking, again, other great costs, other hundreds of kilometers of expedition. On top of this generally hostile land, right? This, as you understand here, it's not full in war, and nothing technically has even to escalate at this point. These were also the ugly issues that would arise for this grand military tour of Italy, right? The second descent, launched in 1158, responded more specifically to Milanese recalcitrants. Right? Already in the first expedition, technically, the formal issue was, again, Pope expelled from Rome, heretics there, back this anti-papal signory movement. And so this is very difficult situation to navigate. Okay, you have to represent the papacy, etc. But fundamentally, the first reason had already been Milan in the first expedition. And here, warfare really has an importance, because after defeating Brescia, there was a communal rival with strong anti-imperial sentiment rooted in its participation in reformist Patarian movements. And freeing Lodi, Barbarossa secured Milan's submission in September without prolonged siege. A second Ronca, because after all, again, you could simply submit to an emperor, but until, say, probably full force was used to crack on your autonomy, things could, okay, this guy has to come back to Germany at some point. Maybe he'll die. Like this had happened historically in other times. So again, everybody is very cautious, the Hohenstaufen included. However, the struggle for dominance soon intensified into a sophisticated game of tactical maneuvering. In July 1159, Barbarossa orchestrated a complex operation near the village of Landriano, south of Milan, designed to draw out and neutralize the Milanese cavalry before he moved to besiege the strategic borough of Crema, as we will see now. And this is a fairly less known clash. Instead, it's quite fascinating. It's true that in this initial phase, like, chronicles are a bit scrambling because every city also has its own tradition. It's a bit confusing, chaotic, at least to reconstruct what happened. But in this clash, after an initial skirmish resulted in the defeat of an Imperial reconnaissance party, Barbarossa personally led a surprise charge against the returning Milanese forces. Catching the exhausted and disorganized communal troops off guard, the Imperial army inflicted heavy casualties, capturing approximately 300 men and 400 war horses. This is really a lot. It shows, again, we will see it better later as well, how involved Barbarossa was also in warfare. This is really the day and age of such kings' direct involvement. Again, look at Philip II, Richard Lionheart, and so on. And in fact, while often dismissed by contemporary chroniclers as a mere skirmish, the Battle of Landriano involved actually over 1,000 knights per side, comparable to major European engagements of the year. And when have you heard this? Like, you know, the little clashes here and there because they were just more publicized in some kind of northwestern European context. Then, what about this? It's an important clash, right? It effectively crippled Milan's offensive capabilities for several months. With the Milanese cavalry decimated, Barbarossa was finally free to focus his full military weight upon Crema without the fear of a flank attack in particular. And now the situation was really starting to escalate. You have the prolonged siege of Crema from July 1159 to January 1160, highlighting the technical and logistical obstacles confronting imperial operations. Crema, a substantial burgh allied with Milan and positioned on the Fulcarian Island amid protective marshes, enabling covert resupply via mixed land-water routes in the Serio River, possessed dual high walls and deep water-filled ditches that made direct assault difficult. Remember that in feudal warfare, it's knights that carry out the attack to the fortification. This is true, again, say feudal, we don't have to oppose it necessarily even to communal. This is exactly what the same Lombard Ghibellines do in the ranks of Barbarossa here. But just for telling you, it really took a lot. These are literally the most fortified areas in Europe, and it's incredibly complicated. You see, the distances are small, right? Crema, these are very close places to Milan, few tens of kilometers, literally, right? You can reach them in one day of march with the army, not even. So, but they're so well entrenched, they're so well fortified and supplied with lots of resources, and especially the will of the defenders, that it's incredibly difficult to dislocate yourself across this Daedalus of canals, of roads, of fortified perimeters. Defenders, in fact, supported by Milanese contingents under Manfred of Dugnano, conducted relentless sorties during the roughly 7-month operation that involved massive engineering by the same Cremonese allies, including construction of enormous mobile siege towers advancing on rollers or sleds behind protective sheds, while defenders deployed multiple mangonels and batteries in sustained counter-battery fire. This was also pretty normal, right? Pretty symmetric, symmetrically tending. Harsh winter conditions compounded miseries for both sides camped in exposed positions. Imperial efforts depended heavily on Cremonese engineers for constructing siege machinery, including a massive mobile tower with an 18-meter square base and height of approximately 42 meters, advancing behind protective quote-unquote cats or sheds loaded with earth to fill ditches as well. That's very interesting. Again, these cities are siding with the emperor against Milan. Remember, Milan has imposed its rule on the surrounding neighbors that towards essentially a tendentially hegemonic rule of Lombardy, which is something that it will actually achieve in the early 14th century, right? But in fact, the cities have their time here to grow themselves, to earn further autonomy and prerogatives that it will use actually against each other afterwards. In speaking of Crema, defenders replied with their own 9 mangonels and batteries, maintaining this continuous artillery duel. One notorious incident involved binding Milanese and Cremasque prisoners to the advancing tower as human shields. The defenders nonetheless did bombard it anyway, causing deaths on both sides and prompting mutual reprisals, including executions of imperial captives on the walls, with further reported atrocities such as the use of catapults against civilians, heightening the siege's brutality. They cut each other to pieces, they set each other on fire. So it was the level of hatred at this point that had been flaring across the two sides. This was really a massive issue. Like the idea, again, on infringing on one's own liberty from one side, the other on essentially wanting to impose an autocratic rule out of universal and therefore divine mandate, something that are going to clash this fiercely. After months of attrition with hardships exacerbating the situation, especially for besiegers camped in tents amid mud and cold, while internal rations trade Crema, terms allowed inhabitants to depart with portable goods. The Borgo was then dismantled. This imperial victory, though strategically valuable in severing Milan-Brescia links in particular, exposed the empire's reliance on Italian allies for engineering in the limits of sustained operations far from German bases. Many of whose princes had already recrossed the Alps, in fact, due to supply strains and seasonal obligations. There was also this aspect, again, who does actually want to fight in Italy? This was a major propaganda issue in Germany for Barbarossa, because there are, I don't know if you ever read Reinhard Fuchs, right? But there are some very interesting figures, right? Metaphors such as Barbarossa the lion trying to close, to destroy with his paw, so to say, the various ants' nests that would be these Italian city-states, and effectively ending up being fragmented himself in the process. So the Germans do not really like these Italian expeditions very much. Again, there is a sense almost of raison d'etre, we've seen from the side of figures like Reinhard of Dassel, And so the most powerful ecclesiastical princes that send their ministeriales, but the lay princes do not really want to go fight in Italy. They try actually to obstacle Barbarossa because he was incredibly powerful in Germany, to even wage war outside of it so consistently. But it is a problem, right? They also would like to rise as rulers themselves. They are expanding towards other areas and against other peoples, but of course there is a lingering rivalry between the Welfen and the Hohenstaufen, even though, as you know, Barbarossa also had both blood, as a matter of fact, which had allowed him to broker this balance policy of sort of subdividing Germany into spheres of influence between him and Henry the Lion. It's a quite dramatic situation. The fall of Crema isolated Milan further, but also galvanized resistance, as the brutality, including this reported atrocities, as we've seen against civilians and prisoners, fueled narratives of imperial tyranny across the communes that circulated in contemporary chronicles. This was shocking enough. You see, from the other side, Barbarossa had subjugated some cities that had also harbored some significant level of heretical movements, right? They're fighting a bit against every kind of constituted authority. It's not like the cities themselves were, but the same local consular regimes fueled these movements so that they could provide some opposition against the same Barbarossa. In this specific moment, it's not very different from what the Hohenstaufen and their supporters will do later with the same Cathars in certain situations, but the thing is under control. As you know, northern Italy, southern France, the Rhineland, etc., they're full of heretics, and in fact, the papacy is actually fighting against this as well, and so it's all very transversal and overlapping, but also used for political convenience at some point, both sides. Following Crema's fall, and with reduced German contingents, Milanese troops shifted to active campaigning. In late July 1160, forces from the Porta Vercelli, these are all gates, right? The one of Vercelli, the one of Como, and the new gate, these were key gates, organizing also the Milanese militia by districts, because the local, so the army was essentially organized on the basis of these quarters, right, with their own entire sort of mini armies, all well supplied, etc. I made a video about Milanese armor that describes how at this point, by the way, Milan has become the most advanced center of metallurgy. Also Brescia, the broader Lombardy. In Europe, it had historically been the Rhineland, right? Since the migration era now, things were pivoting toward another direction. And these Milanese forces capture Coronate, Cesana, Parravicino, and Erba before investing Carcano Castle near Lake Alserio. After 8 days, the remaining gates relieved them. This was the normal mechanism. Like as you understand, the distances are not immense, right? And so all the various city gates rotate military service, and they substitute those who had been out for a time. This was a very efficient system also to supply the army, to maintain fresh troops constantly engaged against the opponents, and to, in fact, resupply at home. This concentrates the entire Milanese infantry, by the way, so it was an important effort. Now, 200 knights from Brescia and Piacenza arrived, while the makeshift carroccio, rapidly assembled on site since the principal one remained in Milan, was brought forward. You know what the carroccio is, by the way. It's essentially a cart that represented not much the city, but the people. Mass was officiated from it. You have similar things. We've seen it at Bouvines also. This existed also in German culture. The Battle of the Standard takes the name after this cart as well. So it's the symbol a bit of especially popular liberty and force. Also because the footmen cannot run away, so they have to stick around the wagon. They can't run away with on horseback, right? So the knights do not even see properly in the city the entire universe of their horizon. They're still part of some broader feudal clienteles that are working across cities. They're more universally minded. And the footmen, we'll see this especially about the Battle of Legnano, if you know how it went, have no choice but relying on their own. Like if cavalry abandons them, they're out there on their own, and they will at that point bet everything on defense to the death, because cavalry is actually starting to become fully decisive at this point. There were instances, we'll see it now, also incredible infantry power and capacity, especially in Italy now, making school for the rest of Europe and giving this very great big sense of hope, right, to all those who had been morally and materially subjugated by especially feudal lordship, right? This especially resonated in Flanders, right? And so this wagon is the best place where to reduce yourself to in a desperate defense, and spiriting you and having probably the symbols of your higher beliefs, and fight and die for it. But so this tells you also how committed the people was. In fact, here we see all the infantry had been involved in this operation. Now, Barbarossa, informed of the threat, advanced from Lodi, camping initially at Vigizzolo on August the 6th, and then between Tassari and Orsenigo, blocking roads with felled trees and forcing the Orsenigo garrison to rejoin the main body. Milanese forces consolidated camps around Carcano, leaving only the Ticino Gate and the Pusterla of St. Euphemia to maintain the investment. Pusterla is the postern, so as a small gate, it was counted among others. There is a geography of Milan, but at some point we'll talk better about the city plan in the Middle Ages. On August the 9th, after Mass and Benediction, the Milanese attacked in coordinated masses. Infantry from the Como Gate seized Tassaria, while the main assault divided. One wing of cavalry and support foot targeted Ghibelline Italian contingents loyal to the emperor. The other confronted German forces. Imperial German cavalry, numbering around 200 plus limited Italian allies, struck the advancing Milanese infantry before it could form defensive squares, breaking the vanguard, disordering the main body, reaching the Carroccio, slaying or dispersing its guard, and overturning it into a ditch. Simultaneously, on the opposite sector, superior Milanese, Brescian, and Piacentine cavalry routed opposing Ghibelline horsemen and their following infantry, then wheeled toward the Imperial camp, where regrouped Milanese foot had already penetrated. Barbarossa hastened back, cleared the camp, and prepared to face the returning communal cavalry, who ultimately declined direct assault. However, isolated with primarily German knights, Barbarossa withdrew to Como. Right? This battle is quite fascinating, right? Because it shows essentially how even the broken infantry had, first of all, probably been out there alone, and even when broken by German cavalry, kind of regrouped and managed to sack the German camp, right? You have this idea, again, the German cavalry is pretty darn good at charging head-on and breaking. That's really the stereotype of the Germans, and this is also a thing. It happened also in other circumstances, like at Tuscol and so on. But at the same time, you see this infantry that normally would simply disperse itself, it actually regroups, even goes on its own. It was sort of properly engaging in open field with a certain degree of confidence, separated from the militas. If you're interested in this dichotomy, I made multiple videos about the autonomy of infantry during the 12th to 13th century, because even though cavalry is at its peak, at least unprecedented peak, the peak will be in the mid-13th century. In this sense, the armies of the Lombard League will take all of that, like the frontal cavalry charges, and this, again, standing their ground against it, even for a day of fighting, and that is something incredibly empowering for all the communes and rustici of medieval Europe. But at the same time, you realize that the reason why cavalry and infantry in these Italian armies were going different ways, which is not really normal, right? And in fact, it's not normal. This is an exception, if you want, at Carcano, but still, like, it's an important battle, and it's the second most important battle of the war, at least in open field. It suggests what is actually going to happen, especially after the wars of the First Lombard League, but as a consequence of what had happened on the same battlefields and how important infantry had been, that namely the petites had started at home to essentially quarrel with cavalry in order to gain to demand more civic rights. So essentially the consular regime would be obstacled at the end of the 12th, beginning of the 13th century, due to the fact that infantrymen had gained an unprecedented confidence, and they wanted to be more represented in the city, and not merely as infantry or the sense footmen and lower. There's not much of a class struggle, but it's the closest it gets during communal history in some way here, but still mostly popular assemblies that had also their own cavalry at some point, especially in the 13th century. At this point, were mostly emerging, in fact, as the footmen that, however, could again maintain their own cohesion even after having been charged by cavalry. When you're broken by an imperial cavalry charge in the 12th century, you're destroyed, all right, mentally, physically, you're done for. These guys reunite and go on attacking the German camp. It's an unprecedented level of cohesion, of moral force, and also of tactical autonomy that is really fascinating. Speaking again of Carcano, the Milanese, victorious tactically but distant from their operational base and facing supply strains. You understand how bloody these battles are. Like, both sides do not really manage to fully break through. So that the Milanese finally lift the siege of Carcano itself. And so strategically, Barbarossa achieved the relief of the castle. The engagement revealed infantry limitations when caught in march formation, yet also, as we just explained, their capacity for partial recovery and continued combat effectiveness once partially reorganized. Ghibelline foot, deprived of cavalry support, proved more fragile instead, and this is, again, we don't know better about the composition, but these were either Italians, right? So it's naturally possible to say, I don't know, here the Milanese were better, right? But there were also troops of other allies. You can imagine the Germans themselves obviously having footmen. Maybe they were mixed there, and definitely German infantry was not as good as the Italian one. But that's the balance we're just illustrating. Neither side's infantry demonstrated prolonged resistance without achieving square formation against cavalry. This was completely normal for the time. Yet, the Milanese regrouping underscored underlying discipline and hierarchical organization within communal units drawn from urban parishes and guilds that historically were not even properly meant to face a knight. Even though, again, Milan had a history of this, especially within the city walls, this was in many ways a unique occasion, something at least bigger than the usual, and witnessing an important degree of experimentation of unprecedented measures, at least that we know of. We'll make more in-depth videos about what do we actually know about the bigger picture of these battles, because it may emerge the misconception that after all, medieval warfare revolves just around these larger engagements, and that we don't know about the rest. But the rest not just was there historically, and there is something always surfacing from that, but it's actually well documented if you actually start studying and trying to reconstruct different aspects. Admittedly, again, it's totally normal for the 12th century in particular not to have overwhelming information, and being really difficult to reconstruct, say, minor engagements in especially these fragmented realities where I understand it's all coalition warfare. So even from a political point of view, it's rare to find the necessity even for a major pitched battle. Like outside, in fact, of the wars of the Lombard League, there were clashes between Italians and some important ones as well, but there wasn't even properly the need with cities that were a few tens of kilometers one from the other, even to escalate in some regional clash that would pit like large, massive armies. This would happen later in the early 14th century, where the Italians actually field some of the largest armies in Europe, as a matter of fact, literally. So even larger than, I don't know, the one of the King of England or Francis. However, At this point, it's all a matter of pragmatism as well. And also, documentarily speaking, it's normal not to have, in fact, sort of much of these other events recollected. What they really cared about, if you read the chronicles, is how much was devastated, what kind of loot they brought back, what kind of offense, of insult they could make. That the greatest ambition was to get to the enemy walls and say, you are a bunch of cowards. Because we arrive here, you don't dislodge us. And this was enormous, like as a moral affirmation. We've seen here, again, also the carroccia often bearing civic banners, an altar for pre-battle rites, and a distinctive bell known as the martinella that signaled alarms and rallies in communal Italy, serving as both a rallying symbol of urban autonomy and a practical, tactical anchor visible across the battlefield as well, embodying civic pride and religious sanction for the defense. If you read, I don't know, the instructions to the Knights Templars, like at some point we'll make a video about that, you realize that the visibility of the banners of the main units was crucial in combat, right, for tactical reliance and order. These repeated pressures, alongside the oppressive conduct of imperial administrators who exacted sevenfold legitimate dues and targeted consuls, bishops, marquises, and captains indiscriminately, galvanized collective resistance all across Lombardy. Here we haven't even talked about, the Veronese League in northeastern Italy. There is a concerted effort, mostly in Lombardy, that is obviously the most important land and the one where the matter is properly to be settled. A second Roncaglia Diet reinforced sovereign supremacy, mandating full payment of regalia to the emperor and provoking, for this reason now, immediate as further communal rebellions. Reinforced from Germany, imperial forces besieged Milan anew in 1162. Most of the German knights here were ministeriales, especially from ecclesiastical clientele. If you're interested in ministeriales knighthood, please check my videos out on them, because I have an entire playlist on them. And exactly what we were saying before, regardless freedom in Germany, the particularity of German knights is that they're not freemen. All right, they are serfs by definition. Naturally, there are free German knights as well, but they are growing to be a minority actually. And I can't now digress just simply on this, but it's important in as much as the fact that still at this point, unlike at the beginning, since the beginning of the 13th century, the church, as in other feudal monarchies, would normally back the in this case the German monarchy, the development of a strong German kingdom, because the lay princes are more brutal. They actually tend to take over, especially through advocacies and other subtle means, the ecclesiastical principalities. Germany is a bit exploded again in terms of public authority, so that, as I've also showed in a video about in the military historical unit series, there are German warrior bishops that are actually present pretty much everywhere, like in France, in Italy, etc. And so they can defend themselves a bit better, because also many of their knights that they don't have to themselves, as they're not freemen, actually are devolved to the imperial expedition, can back them, can support them, right? So mostly from the Rhineland, where there's a lot of ecclesiastical principalities, their areas adjacent to and protected by the Swabian house, right, in the south, participate to, but more regularly, to the imperial force, to the imperial expedition in Lombardy. Now, Milan at this point surrendered again. We're on March the 1st. And this is the most brutal moment where the city, having rebelled, therefore twice, now was completely razed, together with allied centers, with systematic destruction in order to serve as a deterrent across the region. Naturally, the city was not entirely dismantled. The walls, in particular, were to ensure that, reconstruction, at least this recalcitrant, would be less, so it wouldn't be possible in the same way in the future. However, the Milanese do not give up in this sense. They actually start rebuilding. The Contado, in all this, endured systematic ravaging. In 15 days, troops devastated Vertemate, Mediglia, Verano, Briosco, Legnano, the future site of the major battle. Nerviano, Pogliano, and Ro, these are all in the Milanese district. The Germans fell fruit trees and crops to deny resources. This was really typical of the time's warfare. This is actually what Italians normally did against one another, except at this point you have an entire imperial army that is, at this point, in fact, just taking resources away, also across the Alps, and dismantling the very basis of power of these cities, the district, its agricultural resources. Post-submission, imperial vicars imposed annual tribute in kind on rural populations, intensifying hostility, however. These communes were not to give up. Right? You could inflict this structural damage, etc., but you could not erase the cities. You could not simply turn the entirety of the region into a wasteland without the entire region, again, rising against you at the same time. So it's a quite delicate moment and really a massive war of nerves, of iron arm, fundamentally, between these two wills. Such measures, by the way, enforced by figures like Reinald of Dassel, the powerful imperial chancellor and archbishop of Cologne, who championed aggressive policies and played a central role in anti-papal maneuvers as well, bred deep resentment by disrupting established local customs and political autonomy that cities had developed over generations through trade guilds and consular governance. Right? This was unheard of. No other emperor had ever behaved like this. In March 1167, Bergamo, Cremona, Brescia, and Mantua formalized a 50-year mutual assistance pact, explicitly capping obligations at pre-1152 levels under Conrad III of Hohenstaufen. So again, this reign with things had gone well after all, in repudiating the later Roncaglia legislation that, remember, had been issued as an imperial diet in the Italic kingdom. And so it had been subscribed by some representatives of the Lombard cities. Soon joined by Milanese exiles after negotiations limiting ambitions such as rebuilding Crema or extending fortifications beyond the Adda River. By early April, agreements were reached in which Milan sacrificed ambitions such as rebuilding Crema or extending these fortifications. This is the Lombard League. There had been already a Veronese one, as a matter of fact, as I said before. This Lombard League was traditionally founded on April the 7th. So there are also legends surrounding the whole story, but it's important because it was really born at this point in a deeper political and strategic sense. On April 27th, Allied columns from Bergamo, Brescia, and Cremona escorted returning Milanese refugees, enabling provisional reconstruction of defenses, as Milan was still recovering from the destructions inflicted by the emperor. The League expanded decisively on December 1st, 1167, through incorporation of the same Veronese League, formed earlier by Verona, Padua, Vicenza, and the same Venice, interestingly enough, that had, as you know, always had sort of ambiguous role as far as the role between the empires was concerned. Venice was not part of the Holy Roman Empire, differently from these other cities. In any case, as we also explained in a recent video, it was fundamentally functioning in the same way as the other Italian communes that it really was. You have additional communes here reaching 26 and eventually 30 members, including Ferrara, Piacenza, Parma, Cremona, Genoa with its naval power, even though this wasn't much at work here. Bologna, the university center, Padua, Modena, Reggio in Emilia, Treviso, Venice, Novara, Tortona, Vercelli, Vicenza, and Verona altogether. If you look at this is a massive coalition, and it was unprecedented. There wouldn't be in the rest of Italian history, aside from some signories that lord over different cities, like such a vast array of free cities that unite forces to, in fact, clash against a major enemy of this kind. Even during other expeditions, at some point during the Second Lombard League, yes, but it was also a different reality. At this point, the cities are also a bit more individually on their own. They're not so, as we were saying before, properly scholarly different from one another. They're really acting as individual polities fighting for their liberty. The Lombard League Universitas Council, which was the standard term, as you know, for essentially medieval groups, tended towards a single purpose, with appointed representatives deliberated by majority on admissions, war and peace, and gradually acquired normative, taxing, and judicial powers, while instituting a customs union by abolishing the internal dazi tolls that had hindered commerce across the Po Valley. The alliance's confederal system allowed cities to maintain individual governance while pooling military resources, fostering a durable counterweight to imperial ambitions through coordinated diplomacy and resource sharing across the Lombard plain, with rectors providing unified command. Right. This, again, is incredibly important also internationally speaking, because other countries are watching, and so also the empire has to posture itself in quite careful ways. Today, we don't even look, again, at the history properly of the Lombard League as such, the papal support. We're mostly drawing a military history as an introduction to the same. But again, the Po Valley, again, being the sort of the major powerhouse of Europe, at this point coalescing against the Holy Roman Emperor is a big deal, right? Think about all the traffics that came, even towards the same Germany, right, across the very passes used by Frederick to enter Italy, and all what this entail, again, for the context with the Levant and the Outremer states, also with the French markets, the Champagne fairs, it's huge. It's really huge, because the Po River is the waterway that facilitates and enables all these intercontinental trades. And so it's, again, incredibly relevant. The Carroccio, this long custodied in Milan's St. George to the Palace, or Palace of the Reason, bearing the red cross on white field, emblematic of Milanese identity, was actually a color pairing that most Italian cities had for their own. We've seen it again in other videos also about Cremona, about Pisa, etc. And you can see this also in the thumbnail and the pictures I used here. Emerged in and of itself as the League's central symbol. We described the Carroccio before, embodying autonomy and serving both as religious focal point and tactical anchor. So in many ways, it was a bit like a symbolic mascot. Even though it was just an object book, first it was carried pulled by animals and so on. So Milan became the center of the League in many ways, and so even its Carroccio became a bit the symbol of the city that had, yes, created all those problems with the neighbors, but had also suffered heavily, and now was the only one who could lead the struggle for liberty of all these cities together, coalesce against the emperor. So this is a pretty serious situation for Barbarossa, whose fourth descent in late 1166 aimed primarily at supporting anti-Pope Paschal III against Alexander III amid the papal schism that is happening here behind the scenes, obviously because the Holy Roman Emperor has appointed a new pope, because there's been excommunication, it's the usual stuff, bypassed the Veronese mark via the Camonica Valley, but achieved little beyond temporary Roman presence before epidemic, possibly malaria from summer marshlands, compelled retreat. So it's very difficult, again, to campaign with such big armies. And there are some Byzantine sources that are actually claiming that there were Byzantine spies, agents, that present in every Italian city that were poisoning Barbarossa's supplies. This is very interesting because this tells how international the struggle really is. And naturally, certainly the Byzantines may have exaggerated. Obviously, there were many other actors involved because the other big threat was for the Byzantine Empire was indeed like a Germany that managed to hegemonize Italy. This would have been a problem for everybody. And so it would be interesting, in fact, to digress on specific details, but the video is as long as it is already. Now, this expedition involving efforts to install an anti-pope in Rome and secured papal territories further alienated potential allies and exposed the vulnerabilities to disease in summer campaigns south of the Alps. The fifth descent in 1174, so you understand how spaced these expeditions are, because other things are happening in the meanwhile. We should make a beautiful video about Frederick Barbarossa's reign. Well, this fifth descent entered via Savoy, so from the west, with around 10,000 men, thanks to, in fact, Count Humbert III's support, securing northwestern submissions, but failing before Alessandria. The League founded fortress honoring the Pope right after Alexander. It was a brand new city built by the League, quite strategic way. That is still, in fact, an important city in northwestern Italy, and strategically located, in fact, at the Tanaro-Bormida confluence to guard approaches. And this is a massive siege, right? An epic one, even more intense than one of Crema ensued. Right, this spanned the brutal winter of 1174-75, became a definitive turning point that eroded the myth of imperial invincibility. Upon arriving before the freshly minted fortress in late October, Barbarossa's forces, numbering approximately 10,000, attempted a rapid investment. But the city's improvised defenses proved unexpectedly formidable. The defenders, bolstered by an indomitable spirit and the strategic necessity of their position, utilized the marshy terrain and sophisticated network of subterranean tunnels to undermine Imperial siege engines and launch devastating sorties that harassed the German encampment under the cover of darkness. As winter set in with uncharacteristic ferocity, the logistical situation for the besiegers deteriorated rapidly. The surrounding countryside, scorched by earlier operations and depleted of fodder, could not sustain the Imperial host. Horses died by the hundreds from cold and starvation, and the lack of proper winter quarters led to rampant outbreaks of disease. Within the tended camp, Frederick's engineers attempted to breach the walls through the construction of massive wooden towers and a colossal battering ram, yet each assault was met with a rain of projectiles and desperate close-quarter sorties from the garrisons that inflicted heavy losses on the Imperial rank and file. By mid-April 1175, with his army decimated by attrition and the morale of his feudatories fracturing under the strain of a failed venture, Barbarossa was forced to acknowledge the futility of the enterprise. The retreat from the walls of Alessandria was not merely a tactical withdrawal, it was a profound psychological blow that signaled the limits of his authority, leaving the imperial forces disorganized and vulnerable and compelling the emperor to seek the ill-fated negotiations at Pavia in a position of marked weakness. Negotiations in Pavia, in fact, collapsed in May 1175 after premature dismissal of much of the army. At Chiavenna in early 1176, Barbarossa secured limited reinforcements, roughly 2,000 German knights according to the most accepted estimates, but again, there is always a problem of the numbers here. You understand that these videos are merely introductory, just for explaining what happened. Then we will make much more in-depth stuff. Before marching from Como towards Pavia through wooded cover, right? The League, though not fully mobilized at its potential 30,000, which was essentially like the force of a regional army, right? Just like the ones that were confronted here, fielded approximately 15,000 under rectors Anselm from Novara and Ezelin I from Romano, with operational command by Guy from Landriano, and moved to intercept. The clash at Legnano on May the 29th, 1176, resulted from these converging strategies. Imperial troops rested at Cairate and Castelseprio before advancing. The League positioned its carroccio at Legnano along Anolona Scarp for flank protection with infantry and limited knights. The array was likely very normal. You find in some texts like there was a semicircular defensive array spanning 2 or 3 kilometers, but it's not quite the case. You would imagine, of course, lines of shield-bearing spearmen with forward ranks kneeling to create protruding lance hedges to stop cavalry charges, which was impressive enough, considering, again, the fame of German cavalry and their Ghibelline allies. This formation, with successive ranks providing depth and the carroccio as a fixed rail line point on elevated ground near the river, leveraged terrain and communal cohesion where parish-based militia units fought alongside kin and neighbors. An advanced party of 700 communal cavalry encountered 300 Imperial scouts near Borsano or Cascina Brughetto, gaining initial success, and the main German body, approximately 3,000 heavy cavalry, plus Comasque allies, arrived and routed them toward Milan. The pursuing Imperial cavalry then assaulted the Carroccio position. Communal infantry, devoid of cavalry support, comprising parish-based units fighting alongside neighbors and kin, reinforced by at least some dismounted knights, retainers, and possibly general levy elements, withstood hours of repeated charges from morning until mid-afternoon. This is insane. I would like to stress that in Europe, nobody can do this, all right? At this point, the news of the battle, aside from the outcome, as we'll see now, is really big and redraws the entire power alignment. It's not as big as the fact that some citizens and some commoners have properly withstood the might of Imperial heavy cavalry charges in open field, with the same emperor charging against them and holding the line, all right? And doing so, being about to break, some were already abandoning their position. Remember, these guys have been basically abandoned by their own cavalry. It has been successfully defeated by the Imperials, right? So they are holding their ground as best as they can in a strong position, but they are historically, regardless of terrain, destined to be overrun, right? Protected potentially by a constructed or incidental ditch, at least, and motivated by the impossibility of flight, as we explained before, once abandoned by cavalry. The sources say fugere non valentes, so meaning that escaping was not even an option at that point. Some could, as they think the others would hold the line, but in this sense, the line resisted. Opposing enemy impetus would oppose shields and extended spears. Successive lines yielded under pressure, yet the final ranks held, preventing any breach. The Carroccio remained the visible rallying point in all of this, and so this is a mystical moment almost, and you can imagine this second half of 12th century European battlefields, what it meant for these people to fight and die in this way directly, right? Fine, this was in many ways like the greatest chance of everybody. Think about standing ground as a footman, as a commoner, when even your own knights have fled the field. This is it's so empowering to them that it would bring them to death anyway. Like, this was the greatest privilege that they had risen to in their own lives, for how terrible and hellish this really was. This is utterly insane, and stories of this spread far and wide across the continent. The regrouped League cavalry, in the meanwhile, having encountered the main body en route from Milan and reorganized, then struck Imperial flanks and rear. Right, Imperials were about to break through Lombard infantry, and the Lombard cavalry returns the battlefield, attacking Imperial lines from the rear and cutting them down. Right, in half, split, destroying the entire formation. So already fatigued and disordered after sustained assaults, conditions in which heavy cavalry traditionally lost cohesion and momentum, the Germans faced coordinated counter-pressure. They still fought, because normally in these situations, some obviously turn and try to save the situation, but flank attacks are psychologically and physically devastating, probably for formations, unit cohesion. Barbarossa personally charged into the melee to rally his troops at that point. This is an heroic display of personal courage and prowess. Like, again, Barbarossa stands out as one of the greatest commanders of his era. The knightly chivalry culture there is something unspeakable, especially with that Teutonic flavor that we were talking about before. So again, one of the great kings. If you're interested in his legion, by the way, I profusely talk about him in that video about the medieval German slumbering monarchs and the entire mystique of the Imperial Catholic tradition. That is so grandiose, as you know, this people's names. His horse was slain, showing that he was definitely risking his life, and he temporarily vanish amid the fighting as the imperial standard bearer fell, pierced by a lance. Right, when the imperial standard falls, there is something more than morale is collapsing. The army broke. Right, pursuit extended 8 miles to the Ticino, with many slain or drowned. In all this, Barbarossa has disappeared. Nobody knows where he is, whether he's dead on the battlefield. By the way, it's not that easy to recognize, even sort of among the obviously best equipped knights, who is the emperor, right? Who's who in practice. Communal forces captured significant booty, including the emperor's shield, lance, standard, gold, and silver. Because obviously the camp was lost and all that. They moved with their own provisions and wagons and so on. Along with high-ranking prisoners, such as, for example, Berthold IV of Zähringen, Philip of Alsace, and Goswin of Heinsberg. Some of these names are really important. Philip of Alsace, also given the military experience gained on this battlefield, will become one of essentially the great tournament leader of his era in terms of organizer, using shrewd tactics, flank attacks, which is something that he had learned even also on these battlefields. But these are prime noblemen of the Eastern Front. At this point, under Barbarossa, you have probably a kingdom of Germany as opposed as the kingdom of the Eastern Franks. It's a bit like the passage will occur also with Philip Augustus, with France, in a national direction. Losses were light on the League side, heavy for the Imperials. The prolonged infantry stand lasting up to 9 hours through repeated charges and poses for reformation demonstrated the effectiveness of dense spear and shield formations supported by territorial loyalty and the symbolic imperative to protect the Carroccio at all costs. The Carroccio's defense illustrated really infantry potential when formed densely around a symbolic center sustained by territorial cohesion and desperation, though the decisive blow did come from cavalry return. This is also a very important aspect in the history of the art of war. The Italians had by far the best infantries in Europe, but they do not achieve any infantry victory. Not because, again, their infantry was not as good as the one of others that did achieve such victory against cavalry, because they normally fought with cavalry as the decisive arm. So you really have to pick very sort of peripheral and eccentric contexts, I don't know, like Flanders, Scotland, Ditmarsch, and Switzerland, to have armies that were by themselves already just composed by infantrymen and not for flattering reasons that individually succeed here and there, also in relatively small battles to stop heavy cavalry at some point. But it's also something that mostly happens, in fact, in the first half of the 14th century, but you don't have any Italian thing there. And Italian infantry at that point was even much tougher than this one, right? And there is all an interesting historiography and research on this subject that we'll be covering at some point as well. Guy from Landriano's leadership exemplified experienced consular command as well. It shows you like what kind of equestrian culture existed here, capable of rallying, coordinating, so it's really important. Here, there is all a strategic picture. If you saw how the battle was fought, sometimes these guys, like the emperor was passing by, right? And so there is all cities around, and they coordinate. And one contingent comes out, and then another arrives, like in this case. And so they haven't even coalesced forces all together. They literally go at war, like one by one, just deciding in every city what to do in that moment. So it's incredibly interesting. And again, we'll make better videos to explain the entire campaign and battle, so this is really crucial. Very important source is Romuald of Salerno, so from a Southern Italian perspective, informed on the matter, regardless of the distance, right? This outcome, by the way, terminated Barbarossa's fifth descent. But Barbarossa reappeared, right, in Como after days, right, of clandestinity, escaping across the Lombard countryside, not to be caught by the soldiers of the League. So it's an ignominious, this is literally the lowest point of Barbarossa's life in many ways. And so it really makes you think, because the entire point of the empire, like being bestowed probably upon the virtues and the the divine-like at this point being, humiliated in this way, in a quite literal sense, is something that really makes you think. And in fact, also Barbarossa's final, he will keep leading for decades, but as you know, he will die in the crusade, the Third Crusade. Well, there is something there that remains in the legend, as we explained before, also in the idea that he simply disappeared, that his exploit had been divine-like after all. But after Legnano, that was the lowest point of his entire reign. The Hohenstaufen recovered, especially with the marriage between Henry VI, that had been already associated to his father on the German throne, and Constance of Hauteville. And so that's yet another beautiful chapter of history we will see hopefully soon. So this was a major victory for the League that, again, settles the matter, de facto. Barbarossa is still around, actually, but there isn't much to do. There is not a breakthrough possible anymore. Diplomacy followed as a consequence, in a truly Clausewitzian way at that point. So, voice to politics, because the military medium has absolved its function. And you have the 1177 Congress of Venice. Venice poses herself as a medium in all this to say, okay, well, to aggrandize herself, even though she hadn't done too much at least. And this produced a 6-year truce recognizing Alexander III. Well, what is interesting, by the way, is that on these occasions, the Lombards properly brag about all what they had captured from a material point of view from the Imperial capital. It's also a matter of mentality. It's true that they were pivoting towards something more modern and secular in character, but they were also, you have to understand this, competing with one another. The fact that in all this, also Milan resumed her attempts at subduing the surrounding cities, at least in some ways. And so they had to show what they had gained as individual success, which was for the entire commune a huge deal. Again, this is not just about the footmen facing heavy cavalry in open field and holding the line for half a day. This is also about the communes themselves that are not, they're an anomaly. Like in the rest of Europe, they exist, but they don't exist in this protagonistic way or scale or development. At this point, the Italian cities will properly develop towards a statile direction. At this point, they hadn't been. Right? So it's really an innovative experiment that here sanctions on the battlefield its own validity and superiority, and it's something insane. So it's a complete opening of Italian civilization to a higher level of success that unfolds quite impressively in the following generations. These wars, by the way, consume a lot of resources. There is a stopping moment here for all what was destroyed, invested, spent, etc. This is true also up until the death of Frederick II in the wars of the Second Lombard League. And so there are some different stages, as we were hinting at before. We already discussed, especially from a military point of view, in the development of the Italian communes. There's the rise of the people after this war that said, we fought and died for making sort of the consular regime also triumphant here. We want our share of the matter. So very interesting situations. You have negotiations at Piacenza in 1183, facilitated by Alessandria's prior submission, culminating in the Peace of Constance on June the 25th. And in the Peace of Constance, famously enough, the emperor formally acknowledged the League and granted communes extensive autonomy in local administration, justice with imperial vicars limited to appeals exceeding £25 under communal law properly, military recruitment, fortification, and control of resources, including woods, waters, and mills. Consuls could be freely elected upon swearing fidelity to the empire, obviously, while the League itself permitted to persist as a defensive confederation. So basically, Barbarossa grants, these autonomies that had already existed, they were in place. The communes say, okay, well, yes, we obviously recognize imperial rights. We owe you something, and the system has to keep working as it worked before, except, in fact, these communes are heading towards a completely even more autonomous and especially ever more powerful direction, right? the peace is signed in Germany with the presence of the emperor and the communal representatives. It's a big moment. It's a big deal. And the recognition, in fact, of these communes as free men in arms within the Holy Roman Empire, right, as loyal imperial subjects that had won their own liberty on the battlefield. This is, again, incredibly important, properly from an imperial Catholic traditional standpoint. What properly held the entire concept of empire is here showed to be possessed by the Lombard cities as such, right? Their capacity of organization and fighting with impressive armies capable of defeating, in fact, the same imperial one, but it's something incredible, right? This is not anymore like the stereotype of, of the snail, right? Of Charlemagne that arrives, the Longobards shut themselves inside their own cities. There's been much of this, as we've seen. Siege warfare is actually very important in all this, but this is more, right? Shutting yourself inside or withstanding a siege is contrary to the stereotype that medieval warfare was all about sieges. No, it wasn't all about sieges, and pitched battles were actually pretty frequent. And at this point, the Lombards have an army that can't face the imperial one in open field. So this is something really entirely unique in many ways. Not even other countries normally had this at a regional level, unless they were a monarchy proper, right, of the most advanced kind, say France, England, Castile. You couldn't, and you wouldn't normally mobilize these forces, even properly by size and scale. So this is a moment in which the Lombard cities level up into probably a different age ushering in. We'll see better in other videos. So as we said, in return, communes recognized imperial suzerainty, paid the fodrum, so that every time the emperor came, like, he had to be supplied, and as he had to organize it matter. And admittedly, from this time onward, things would tendentially go differently. Like, the emperor will not try until Frederick II to properly try to subdue the entirety of northern Italy. That also at the time it happens in fairly different ways, even though Frederick II does repeat like his grandfather's attitude in brutality, but also called much more like local leader. So it's a very different time already. And this was arguably the last big chance properly for the Holy Roman Empire to fully unite in a credible sense and reunite the entirety of Europe and the Mediterranean. The Lombards stand in between, but this is exactly the point. They stand as freemen of the empire as well. So there is something about the mechanisms that had followed, like the fall of the Roman Empire historically in antiquity, that here show you the limits of the entire medieval world all across literally Eurasia and beyond. Like, there is a new type of power, or at least a new source of power and new levels of different levels, at least of capacity and properly retaining the same power. So this gets philosophical and metaphysical easily in the succession and various eras in the history of mankind, but it is definitely showed here. There is even a one-time indemnity of £15,000, an annual 2,000 to the emperor for the war, relinquishing certain regalia. But this can be paid by the Lombards. This doesn't bother them. Like, what they want is to gain, as we've seen before from the income, a much wider amount of wealth from their possessions and being left autonomous, right? You have the agreement issued as an imperial privilege confirming prescriptive rights for customary usage over decades as well. And so the settlement preserved nominal overlordship while confirming the commune's hard-won jurisdictional independence and the League's confederal framework as a durable counterbalance to centralized imperial governance. This thing does stand, even if Italians start fighting against each other once again. They're also incredibly self-aware, and as they had always been recognized regardless of their political fragmentation. These were the Lombards, like, abroad, right? And they were ever more obviously protagonistic in European politics, like in this case, warfare, technology, art, literature, etc. This pragmatic compromise, building on prescriptive rights claimed by cities over decades through customer usage allowed Barbarossa, by the way, to salvage elements of imperial prestige in Germany and occasional revenues while acknowledging the military and political realities exposed by repeated campaigns in Italy. And so one could sort of talk more about what is the broader meaning of this, right? Well, these wars demonstrated the Commune's capacity for resilient combined arms defense, adaptive alliance building, and effective use of symbols like the Carroccio, ultimately compelling pragmatic imperial accommodation after repeated demonstrations of the limits of even formidable German heavy cavalry against determined urban infantry supported by timely cavalry intervention overall, right? In many ways, everything was much more symmetrical. This was a clash between peers in many ways. Even the Carroccio, as we've seen, was not really much the symbol of the city per se. It was the symbol of the tectonic footmen of some kind of, the knights remained within the framework of a feudal establishment, seeking recognition, in fact, from the empire. Also, the future city lords will do so, again, quite autonomously. But there are also large parts of feudal possessions in Italy that constantly interact with the communes. So it's a very variegated and sort of complex relation, and this is all ever more international, by the way, in nature. As we were saying before, the Lombard League's success influenced broader European perceptions of urban resistance and balanced governance, contributing to developing ideas about rights, alliances, and limits on monarchical power in the medieval West, with its model of confederal cooperation later echoing in subsequent leagues against imperial overreach. Right? If you think about the Magna Carta, for example, that comes very indirectly from the defeat of a country at the hands of another. Well, this is sort of unanimously praised today. In a way, it stemmed actually from a disaster. And it does regulate government. It does somehow limit tyrannic arbitrium, even though, as you know, I'm a great fan of King John. And I think it was right in many ways, at least as far as his capacity and power was concerned. He sort of saved, in part, the same monarchy, even after the defeats that had, however, almost brought to the destruction of the Capetians. So very, very shaded aspect. But in this sense, especially when people want to act traditionalist and they say, oh, the Lombards, these were just a bunch of third estates, because they read Evola and they think that that's how things should go. That's not how it is, right? Historically speaking, I must say, Evola was great at sort of philosophical and religious reconstruction, but let's say historically wasn't overwhelmingly, let's say, informed and especially objective about this. Like while there were trends of this kind, formally, what you're looking at is fundamentally the triumph of nobility and freemen in arms in this sense. And yes, it stems from a different system from the one, let's say, monarchies were habituated with, but even in some more modern, it's interesting how opinions change so quickly. That's why I made the parallelism with the Magna Carta, because that is overly celebrated, and it wasn't even as important as other documents that came later in the English constitutions. When you look at the Peace of Constance, the Lombard League, and the civic tradition of the Italian Communes, well, you should perhaps start thinking that this was one of the single most important achievements in the history of mankind, right? That Western identity and law and authority and discipline and, in the sense, civic participation, the idea of the citizen soldiers, that wouldn't be the same hadn't the Lombard League defeated the Holy Roman Emperor at Legnano, right? And they hadn't, by the way, within a European framework of an imperial Christian force, and that the same Lombards were part of, defined, in fact, at the end of the day, still an alliance, a pact, a negotiated recognition, mutual recognition of power with the same emperor, right? Very far from being an anti-traditional direction, actually. And this topic is not overwhelmingly debated, unfortunately, as I said before, for its historical relevance. Again, very well researched in many ways, because it's the story that also from the other side, for many other peoples, get perhaps a bit too much overstated. That the people fighting against tyranny. Also from Barbarossa's side, yes, it was actually, the Germans were objectively very brutal, right? This may be a cliche, but it's actually not, may sound as one, But say the Germans were not like the Westerners, all right? They were something very different. They came from a very different world, and it was recognized at the time that it was this kind of more primitive character. But indeed, as far as the Imperial Catholic traditional doctrine is concerned, of course, Barbarossa was fighting for a principle that did seem to him valid, right? And that was to be measured in arms. There was literally no other way in Imperial Catholic tradition. If you have power, it manifests, and if you try to curb it and you fail, it means that you were not enough or that you were in the wrong. In any case, this is a quite crucial affirmation of it, and it should be appreciated. We'll talk more about, in this sense, the military character of the consuls, of the consular regime. At this point, we'll talk more about Italian knighthood, and we'll talk also more about these Italian infantries that we haven't quite looked at also in quite deeper detail. For example, there is the destruction of Susa and Asti in 1174, right? At the beginning of the Fifth Descent. These were not mere strategic stops. Susa was notably razed, and Asti was forced to submit as well. So this is from the Burgundian side of the entrance. And that's why eventually things escalate towards Alessandria, also because, again, the display of destruction had been so important. The Lock of Verona, we mentioned before how the Veronese prevented Barbarossa's return, and he had to make this roundabout and go back to Germany through the Camonica Valley. There's also the siege and destruction of Tortona, right? That stands parallel to the destruction of Milan and Crema in 1155. This was this brutal proof of concept for Barbarossa's early campaigns, demonstrating his willingness to use total war against minor cities that resisted his authority. There's also the struggle for Rome that is quite important, but today we talk about the Lombard League as well, so perhaps I'm going to make a video about Barbarossa's military history that is going to overlap in part with this, but this is more like the clash between the two, and so it is a different thing from also the clash with other polities. There is also the most famous episode of Frederick Barbarossa kneeling personally as a cousin, not just as a sovereign, which was something unbelievable, and it tells you how serious the situation was to in front of Henry the Lion to ask for troops, for support, right, in the Lombard campaign, what would be Legnano. And so there is this deep concern, this sense that Barbarossa's stakes were entirely placed, as far as the imperial fortunes were concerned, on the success in the war against the Lombard League. And these are really, again, dramatic moments for everyone involved, because we actually know fairly a lot about them in for these times that, as we said before, are not particularly sort of rich in information in absolute terms, but for Italy, there's really enough in the chronicles in the following generations. So warfare, military capacity escalate, really. And so we have pretty detailed accounts of how this entire operations kind of work. We know that lots of things, other things were going to happen. So our next video of this kind will be obviously the wars of the Second Lombard League. And so the 13th century, quite different world, but a quite different world because what had happened here had brought that about. And so this is incredibly relevant, incredibly crucial, and we really must see it better at some point. Really glad to talk about this because, again, there is also a lot more detail, but I can't make videos that are longer than 2 hours. That's why I prefer to make more thematic videos or other mini chronologies. I don't know, the history of the Siege of Alexandria, or, there are so many engagements that are worth recounting here, and that we will see individually more in depth in a complete fashion, right? But you know how the channel works, so I don't have to repeat myself all the time with this. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.